Welcome back, everyone. We're kicking off the year with something I think a lot of you will find really relevant to your work, and maybe even your lives in general. It's hard to ignore how hard it is to really focus these days, right? I mean, everywhere you turn, there's another distraction. Notifications, emails, you name it. It's like a constant battle for our attention.
Yeah, it's definitely something we all struggle with, especially with technology becoming well, so pervasive in our lives.
And that's exactly why I'm excited about today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring Cal Newport's book, Deep Work: Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World.
Oh, that's a great one. Newport makes some really compelling arguments about how our ability to focus deeply is becoming even more valuable in this world of
It's
distraction.
almost like a paradox, right?
Exactly. It's valuable, but it's also becoming harder and harder to achieve.
So before we get too far, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what deep work actually means. Because Newport has a very specific definition.
Right. He's not just talking about putting in long hours. It's about the quality of that focus.
Can you remind us of his exact definition?
Sure. He defines deep work as, and I'm quoting here, professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive capabilities to their limit. These efforts create new value, improve your skill, and are hard to replicate.
So it's about pushing your mental limits, creating something truly valuable, and doing work that can't just be easily copied by anyone.
Exactly. It's that combination that makes deep work so potent.
And this is where the contrast with shallow work comes in, right?
Right. Shallow work is like the opposite of deep work. Things like checking email, attending routine meetings, or, just scrolling through social media.
Oh, I'm definitely guilty of that last one. But, those shallow tasks often take up so much of the day. It's crazy.
It is, and it's often deceptive because it feels like we're being productive when we're checking things off our to-do list.
But are we really making a dent in the things that truly matter?
That's the question Newport wants us to ask ourselves. And to illustrate the importance of deep work, he uses some really interesting examples.
Okay, I'm all ears. Who does he talk about?
Well, one example is Nate Silver, the data journalist known for his election predictions.
Oh, yeah, he's incredible. His work with complex data and algorithms must require some serious deep work.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of how a skilled knowledge worker, someone who can really focus deeply, can create incredible value. Another example he talks about is David Heinemeier Hansson. He's the creator of Ruby on Rails, which is a popular web development framework.
I've heard of Ruby on Rails, but I'll admit I don't know much about it. How does his work connect to deep work?
Well, Heinemeier Hansson is a great example of what economists call the superstar effect. Basically, technology allows the very best in a field to reach a global market.
So it's not just about being good anymore, it's about being the absolute best.
Right. And that often takes the kind of intense focus and skill development that comes from deep work.
So we've established that deep work is super important. But if it's so essential for success, why aren't we all doing it? Why do we seem to be drawn to all these distractions?
That's the paradox, isn't it? And I think there are a few reasons why we struggle with this.
Okay, lay it on me. What are some of the factors that make deep work so hard to come by?
Well, for one, there's what Newport calls the principle of least resistance. It's this idea that without clear feedback on what's truly impactful, we tend to gravitate towards the easiest thing in the moment.
And shallow work is definitely easier than deep work, I'll give you that.
Oh, absolutely. Checking email feels much more manageable than tackling a complex project, right?
It's that instant gratification thing, isn't it? It's so tempting.
It really is. Another factor is what Newport calls busyness as a proxy for productivity.
Yes. It's like we're trying to prove our worth by showing how busy we are, even if that busyness isn't actually leading to anything meaningful.
Exactly. It's like we equate activity with achievement, but they're not always the same thing.
Okay, so we've got the principle of least resistance and busyness as a proxy for productivity. What else is getting in our way?
Well, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, can we?
Social media.
Yep. The cult of the internet, as Newport puts it. There's this idea that everything online is inherently good and innovative, but
Look, it can also be incredibly distracting.
exactly. And it's designed to be that way.
I know. It's scary how good they are at keeping us hooked.
It's all about reclaiming our attention and our ability to focus in a world that's constantly trying to fragment it.
Okay, so how do we break free from this cult of distraction and start making deep work a bigger part of our lives?
That's what we're going to delve into next. But before we do, I think it's important to connect this back to something bigger than just productivity.
Oh, this is where it gets interesting. I'm ready. What's the bigger picture here?
Well, Newport makes a powerful argument The deep work isn't just about getting more done. It's about living a more fulfilling life.
Oh, I like where this is going. Tell me more.
He uses this amazing example of a master bladesmith named Rick Furrer. Furrer makes these incredible swords and knives using traditional blacksmithing techniques. It's very intense, very hands-on.
I bet. I've always been fascinated by blacksmithing. It's a true craft.
It is, and it requires incredible concentration and dedication, just like deep work.
I can only imagine.
And even though his work is physically demanding, not exactly glamorous, Furrer finds incredible satisfaction in it.
He's found a sense of purpose and mastery in his work, even though it's tough.
Exactly. And Newport argues that we can find a similar kind of fulfillment through deep work.
So even in our modern knowledge work jobs, which may not involve, forging metal, we can still find that same sense of craftsmanship.
Precisely. And that's where the strategies he outlines in his book become really powerful. But we'll dive into those in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. I'm ready to learn how to bring more of that deep work magic into my own life. All right, so we left off talking about how deep work can actually lead to a more fulfilling life, not just a more productive one. Now I'm really eager to get into those strategies you mentioned for actually cultivating a deep work ethic.
Well, the good news is Newport doesn't just leave us hanging with this idea of deep work. He lays out some very practical approaches and even different philosophies for how to integrate it into your life.
Philosophies, huh? I like that. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of thing?
Exactly. He outlines 4 of them, each with its own set of rules and practices. He calls them, let's see, monastic, bimodal, rhythmic, and journalistic.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Can you break those down a bit for us?
Sure. So the most extreme one, the monastic philosophy, it's kind of like the digital hermit approach. Think of someone who completely isolates themselves to focus intensely on their work.
Like a writer who goes off to a secluded cabin to finish a book.
Exactly. Now, the bimodal philosophy is a bit less intense. It's more about alternating between periods of deep work, like really advanced focus, and then periods of more, normal work life.
So you might dedicate a few days a week to deep work and then the rest of the time to everything else.
Right, or even a month out of the year or something like that. It's about finding chunks of time to really go deep.
That sounds a lot more manageable for most people, I think, especially if you have, a family or other commitments.
Definitely. And then there's the rhythmic philosophy. This one's all about incorporating deep work into a regular routine. Like maybe you always dedicate the first 2 hours of your morning to deep work.
I like that. It's about making it a habit, like going to the gym or meditating.
Exactly. And finally, there's the journalistic philosophy. This one's more about fitting in deep work whenever you can.
So it's more flexible, more adaptable to a changing schedule.
Right, like a journalist who has to switch between writing a long-form piece and covering breaking news.
Okay, so those are the philosophies. Now, what about the actual strategies? What are some of the things Newport recommends for getting the most out of our deep work sessions?
Oh, he's got a whole toolkit of them, actually. But one of my favorites is the idea of ritualizing deep work.
Ritualizing. What do you mean by that?
Think about athletes who have pregame rituals or musicians who warm up before a performance.
It's about creating a routine to get yourself in the right mindset.
Exactly. It could be anything from, making a cup of tea to clearing your workspace to putting on noise-canceling headphones.
I love that idea. It's like signaling to your brain that it's time to focus, no distractions allowed.
Right. It's about being intentional. Another big one he talks about is the importance of shutting down completely at the end of the day.
Oh, that's a tough one for me. I'm always tempted to just check one more email or scroll through social media before bed.
I know it's hard. But Newport argues that giving your brain a complete break is crucial for actually being able to focus when you need to.
So it's about letting go of work completely so you can recharge and come back fresh the next day.
Exactly. And this might be the most structured strategy, but he also recommends scheduling every minute of your workday.
Every minute. Whoa, that sounds intense.
It sounds a bit extreme, I know, but it's about being intentional with your time. When you plan your day in advance, you're less likely to get sucked into shallow tasks.
I guess that makes sense. If you don't have a plan, it's easy to just get pulled in all sorts of directions.
Another helpful strategy is quantifying the depth of your work. Actually tracking how much time you're really spending in deep focus.
So instead of just thinking, I'm doing deep work, I'd be measuring it.
Right. You could use a timer or a time tracking app. There are lots of ways to do it, but the key is to be aware of where your attention is actually going.
I think that would be really eye-opening. You might be surprised at how much time you're not actually spending in deep work.
And then, of course, there's the idea of draining the shallows,
Mm.
finding ways to minimize those less demanding tasks to free up more time for deep work.
Yeah. So things like batching similar tasks together, being more selective about meetings, learning to say no more often.
Exactly. It's all about prioritizing. And then there's training your attention, building your concentration skills like you would train a muscle.
Wait, so you're saying we can actually get better at focusing?
Absolutely. It's not just something you're born with. Newport suggests things like productive meditation, where you use downtime, like walks, to actively think through problems.
I've actually found that I get some of my best ideas when I'm out for a walk or just doing something mindless. It's like my brain is free to wander.
Exactly. It's about actively engaging your mind, even during downtime. He even talks about memory training techniques like memorizing a deck of cards to strengthen your focus.
That's fascinating. I never would have thought of that.
And then, of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to deep work.
Social media.
Yep, that's the one. It's like the ultimate attention fragmenter.
It's so hard to resist the pull of the scroll. I know I spend way too much time on it.
Well, Newport has some pretty radical ideas about how to deal with that. He calls for a craftsman approach to social media.
What does that mean?
It's about being really honest with yourself about whether a particular platform is actually serving you or if it's just a distraction.
So it's not about quitting social media altogether, but being more mindful about how you use it.
Right. And to really test this, he suggests something he calls a social media packing party.
A packing party? What's that all about?
It's simple. You quit all social media for 30 days, cold turkey.
30 days. That's a long time.
It is, but it's designed to break that addictive cycle and see what happens. He argues that most people find they don't actually miss it as much as they thought they would.
So it's about challenging those assumptions and fears of missing out.
Exactly. And it can free up a ton of time and mental energy.
Okay, that's pretty radical, but I can see the appeal. It's about reclaiming control.
Right. And speaking of reclaiming control, Newport also talks about how to apply this thinking to our free time outside of work.
Oh, yeah. That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. How to make the most of my downtime.
Well, he has this great idea inspired by a writer named Arnold Bennett. Bennett argued that we should treat our free time as a day within a day.
A day within a day. I like that. So it's like this precious opportunity for self-improvement and meaningful activities.
Exactly. He suggests scheduling this time, just like you would schedule your work hours.
Not to turn leisure into work, but to be more intentional about it.
Right, so instead of just collapsing on the couch and zoning out, you might choose to read, spend time with loved ones, or pursue a hobby.
Okay, all this is great for individuals, but what about the workplace as a whole? Can we create a culture that actually supports deep work?
That's a great question, and Newport does address it. He talks about a software company called 37 Signals. They famously implemented a 4-day work week.
Oh yeah, I've heard of them, but didn't they just end up cramming 5 days of work into 4?
That's what a lot of people think, but what's interesting is that they actually encouraged their employees to do less work.
Wait, really? Less work. How does that work?
The focus was on eliminating shallow tasks and prioritizing deep work.
So it's not about working less, it's about working better.
Exactly. And the company's founder said it was a huge success. Employees were just as productive, if not more so.
So it's possible to achieve more by doing less, but more focused work.
That seems to be the lesson here. And even if your company doesn't have a 4-day work week, Newport argues that you can still apply these principles to your own work life.
So things like setting boundaries around your work hours, being more selective about meetings, finding ways to batch tasks together.
Right. It's about being proactive and shaping your work environment to be more conducive to deep work.
Okay, so let's say you're trying to create this space for deep work in a workplace that's not necessarily set up for it. What are some practical things you can do?
Well, one thing Newport recommends is quantifying the depth of your work.
Ah, there's that idea again. So tracking how much time you're actually spending on deep work versus shallow work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can be really eye-opening to see where your time is actually going.
Once you have that data, you can start making more strategic decisions about your time.
Exactly. Another idea he suggests is implementing a sender filter for your email.
A sender filter. I've never heard of that. What is it?
It's a way to manage the flow of incoming messages and encourage more thoughtful communication.
Okay, I'm interested. How does it work?
Well, he actually uses himself as an example. He has this filter set up so that anyone who wants to email him has to jump through a few hoops first.
Like reading an FAQ or answering some questions.
Yeah, stuff like that. It's basically a way of setting expectations and creating a barrier to entry.
So it forces people to really think about whether their email is worth your time.
Exactly. It can seem a bit extreme, but it's surprisingly effective.
I like it. It's about protecting your time and attention. What else?
He also suggests putting more work into the emails you do send, making sure they're clear, concise, and actionable.
That makes sense. It can save a lot of back and forth in the long run.
And finally, he encourages us to just not respond to emails that don't actually require a response.
Really, just ignore them. That's bold.
It is, but he points out that a lot of academics do this, and it helps them to be much more productive.
So it's about challenging those ingrained expectations of constant responsiveness. It's about reclaiming control over our inboxes.
Exactly. You don't have to be a slave to your email.
This is all so thought-provoking. We've covered so much ground, from the different philosophies of deep work to all these practical strategies for cultivating it in our lives and in our workplaces.
That's a whole new way of thinking about work and productivity, isn't it?
You know, as we've been talking about all these strategies for deep work, it makes me think about how much our work culture kind of pushes us to be always on, always available, always checking messages. How can you possibly do deep work when you're always expected to be responsive?
Yeah, that's a huge obstacle, and Newport actually tackles this head-on in the book. He suggests this idea of fixed schedule productivity, which is basically the opposite of that always-on mentality.
Fixed schedule productivity. That sounds interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, it's all about setting a clear endpoint to your workday and then working backward to figure out how to get everything done within those set hours.
So instead of letting work just kind of spill into our evenings and weekends, we draw a line in the sand and say, okay, this is work time and this is non-work time.
Exactly. It's about taking back control of your time and your attention instead of letting the demands of the digital world dictate how you spend them.
I can see how that would be helpful, especially when we consider the importance of rest and recharge. If you're always on, you never really get a chance to fully disconnect.
That's a key point. When you have a fixed endpoint to your workday, you're more likely to prioritize tasks effectively, you'll eliminate distractions better, and you're more likely to actually disconnect and recharge when you're off work.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Have you found that this approach works for you personally?
I used to be terrible about this, always working late, checking emails at all hours. But I started experimenting with this fixed schedule idea, and it's been a game changer, honestly.
Really? How so?
I get way more done in less time, and I feel much less stressed overall. It's by setting those boundaries, I actually created more space for focus and, ironically, got more done.
That's amazing. It's a good reminder that sometimes setting limits can actually make us more productive. Do you have any tips for someone who's trying to implement this fixed schedule approach? Where do you even start?
Well, Newport suggests making a ritual of planning your workday. Like a little pre-work routine. Take a few minutes each morning or even the night before to sketch out your day.
So block out time for both deep work and those shallow tasks we talked about.
Exactly. Be proactive, have a plan, don't just react to whatever pops up.
That sounds like a good place to start. What else?
He also suggests being really aggressive about eliminating shallow obligations, things that aren't truly essential. Maybe it's declining certain meetings, delegating tasks, or even figuring out how to automate some of your work.
I think that's where a lot of people struggle. It's hard to say no, you don't want to disappoint anyone.
It's true, it's tough. But you have to remember that saying yes to everything often means saying no to the things that really matter.
That's a really good point. It's about recognizing that our time and attention are limited, and we have to be mindful about how we spend them.
Absolutely. Another thing that's been huge for me is really protecting those deep work blocks, really fiercely protecting them. Turn off all notifications, close the email inbox, even put your phone in a different room.
Create that distraction-free zone.
Right. Deep work deserves that kind of respect and attention. It shouldn't be something you try to squeeze in between emails.
This has been such an incredible conversation. We've gone from the big picture idea of deep work to all these practical strategies for actually making it happen.
It's a powerful shift in thinking, isn't it? And it applies to so many different areas of life.
It really does. I'm feeling really inspired to take back control of my time and attention and see what I can achieve with a little more focus.
And that's what I hope listeners will take away from this deep dive. It's about realizing that you have more control over your time and attention than you might think. And that deep work isn't just about productivity, it's about living a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap things up. But before we go, I want to leave you with a little challenge. Cal Newport says, a deep life is a good life, and I couldn't agree more. So I want to ask you, dear listener, where can you carve out space for more deep work in your life? What's one small step you can take today to start cultivating this habit?
Give it a try. Experiment with some of the strategies we've discussed and see what happens. You might be surprised at what you're able to achieve when you give yourself the gift of deep focus.
Until next time, keep diving deep